And welcome to our Bloomberg radio audience. So excited to have this as part of our show, the Bloomberg Green Festival. Well, for those of you who've been paying attention, we actually kicked off this entire festival with one of the co-founders. You might have heard of him, Matt Damon. Now we're going to turn to the folks who are doing some of the most important work in the world when it comes to water. We're talking about, of course, the CEO and co-founder of water.org, Gary White, and the president of water.org, Jennifer Schorsch. Guys, thank you so much for joining me.
All right, thanks to be here. Good to be here, Jason.
So, Gary, I want to start with you. Tell me about the organization at this moment, because we are in a global pandemic. I don't need to remind anybody about that, but I do wonder how it has changed your work. That is the top headline every day, it feels like.
Well, it has had a tremendous impact on our work. And what I see is it calls much more for us to pay attention to water and sanitation, particularly for the global community. One of the first things that we heard when this pandemic struck is like, you should wash your hands vigorously and you should wash them often. And in the United States, and we have that ability without a thought, having be able to do that. But when you think about people around the world, more than 2 billion people who don't have access to safely managed water and sanitation, that simple act is a huge hurdle every day. So we can see how the pandemic is exacerbated in those types of environments. And as we know, this pandemic doesn't know any national borders. And so it's easy to see how that can spread from one poor person living, in the slum in Mumbai to somebody in New York. And it is all interconnected. And I think the thing about water and sanitation, water in particularly, as we'll see today, it's completely interconnected with climate. And when we talk about some of the world's most vulnerable populations and climate, what they're going to see is this lack of security. As we get more flooding and more drought, it forces people who are already living on the margins, who might have access, but tenuous access now to these services, to completely lose that and backslide.
Well, Jennifer, let's get right to the heart of that, because Gary teed it up for us beautifully. Let's talk about that intersection, because I have to confess, as I started to really dig into this, I was blown away by the connection and the urgency of this from a climate perspective that I don't think I fully appreciated. So help us understand, because you guys have done some amazing recent work that really crystallizes, as I say, this intersection of climate and water crises.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. You struck upon a really important concept, which is the urgency of it. I mean, like climate change, I think people really might think of this as an issue of tomorrow, but the water crisis is an issue of today. A third of the world's population lives in water-stressed areas right now. We talked about COVID. 3 billion people cannot wash their hands at home in the midst of a pandemic. And every morning, women and girls around the world wake up and collectively spend 200 million hours simply trying to provide for the needs of their family in water. And so it's, and on Gary mentioned sanitation, that's more than twice the issue of water. So it's an issue right now, and it is an issue that has real human costs and real economic costs. And as climate progresses, the water crisis will only get worse.
And so let's talk a little bit more about that and how it manifests, Gary, because there are a number of different ways, some obvious, some not so obvious, where the changing climate is inextricably tied to the water crisis. One of them, sort of going the other way in terms of trying to get water to people, is that it sometimes, just to put it very simply, isn't always good for the earth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when we talk about water scarcity and how we allocate the water resources that we do have, it's important to keep in mind that, only about 10% of the water that we consume goes towards human needs, if you will, so household level water and sanitation. And then when we especially look at those 2 billion people, they're folks that aren't showing up, for water with drinking it through a fire hose. They're coming with a straw, right? People living in poverty are certainly, if we get them access, they certainly are not going to exacerbate this crisis. There's many ways that we can do that while still conserving the water resources. And I think when we see water and climate come together, we do see it in terms of adaptation. How are we going to ensure the resilience of the populations that are on the margins right now in the context of water access? And that's important. It's kind of the least among us who are going to be affected first. We know that as drought strikes and water scarcity hits, that we're going to have people that need to migrate. We're going to have climate refugees because of their water supply. But on the other side, just to take it a little bit more in a different direction, it's interesting to hear Bill Gates talking about some of the carbon issues and like cement and things like that. I think one thing that people don't realize is how much carbon is embedded in water. So if we look at solving this crisis from a mitigation perspective for carbon and climate, that's important to realize as well. We don't realize, for instance, that 25% of all the electricity consumed in California goes towards sourcing and moving and treating and distributing water that comes into people's homes. We don't recognize that globally, we have utilities that lose half of all that water that's treated because of leaky pipes and poor infrastructure. If we could just save 20% of that, that's the equivalent between now and 2030. If we could save 20% of those losses, that would be like taking 211 million cars off the road for a year in the United States. So we need to get tuned into more how much this whole water supply system and infrastructure and the shortcomings in it cause us to use more carbon than we need to deliver the water that's so important.
Jennifer, I want to take it in a slightly different direction and stay a little bit domestic here, because one of the things that we've talked a lot about in this current crisis is where people live, how they live, the disproportionate impact, as we've been talking about, of the pandemic. When we think about the climate, one of the things we know is that our rising sea levels are going to affect where we live. Water is going to play a detrimental role to some extent in that. How does your work sort of figure into that, and how do you think about water in that context?
Sure. So if we think about the water issue, we really want to focus on the quality, the quantity of it, how much is available for use, the quality of the water, and then the accessibility of the water. And as we mentioned, we are really looking at those who are disproportionately affected by this. It was interesting hearing Bill talk about vaccines, because like many things, the impact of the water crisis is disproportionately borne on the shoulders of people living in poverty. And so we are focused on the access element of water and sanitation, and what I like to call the humanity of water. As Gary referenced, corporations, industrial and agricultural use is 90% of the freshwater supply. About 2/3 of the freshwater supply is used for, it's estimated, the supply chain and the provisioning of products. So we have to have corporations participate in this, and we have to address not only stewardship, quality, health, and the quantity of water available, but also the access, the accessibility of it. So our work is singularly focused on ensuring that those living in poverty, the 2 billion people who live without every day, have access to safe water and sanitation. And that's what we bring to the table. The lens that we bring is different. We approach this through affordable finance. So it's really about removing the barriers that exist for those individuals living in poverty, and doing it by creating a system, wrapping a system around them that starts with an affordable loan to allow them to hook up to the water system that runs right under their feet. They just don't have the savings to connect to that or to build a toilet in their home. So we focus on that individual living in poverty. We enable often her to get access to a loan to get that water connection. And what we're seeing is that there is a market that is playing out. More than 6 million loans enabled, 30 million people now have access to water and sanitation, and they're doing it through saving their time and saving their resources. And that has created a commercial lending portfolio of $2.4 billion, which is put in the hands of people living on less than $6 a day.
So Gary, talk about that a little bit more, and the growth of that, and how that finance piece is essentially enabled, because this is right in the Bloomberg sweet spot, I have to say, in terms of our audience and sort of understanding the underpinnings financially.
Yeah, and I think what's exciting about this is that there is a solution, and in many ways, this problem of helping people in poverty get access contains its own solution. And as Jennifer was mentioning, we work through getting access to microloans to people living in poverty. And just real quickly, how that works, there was a woman I met recently in the Philippines. Her name was Lina Riza, and she was paying a water vendor, someone who sold dubious quality water in her neighborhood, about $30 every month to bring water to her home. And what I'm sorry, she was paying about $60. And then so what we saw was the opportunity for her to connect to this utility, but she didn't have the upfront money to do that. So through our program, she was able to get a small loan and able to capture those savings. So now she's paying about $10 a month for her water bill and for her loan combined. So she's able to save $50. And so every month, that's money that's back in her pocket. So that's how this system can work. And it is about trying to bring the global capital markets to bear on this. So we work with local microfinance institutions to bring that capital into the system so people like Lina Riza can get those loans. And as this has evolved, we've realized that we can actually see new ways, and looking at social impact investing, for instance, to drive more capital into the system so that these loans can be scaled up. And water.org was actually able to create and stand up and spin off a new entity, WaterEquity, that brings the capital markets to bear, giving investors an attractive rate of return so that we can then scale up these small loans and then expand to micro enterprises that serve the poor as well as utilities. And that's what we can offer accredited investors who want to learn more. They can invest in this with that type of vehicle, but also we need that philanthropic capital that sets all this in motion to do those things that Jennifer was talking about, to correct those market failures. And that's what we're trying to do, use these innovations to show that people living in poverty are actually not necessarily a problem to be solved, but a market to be served.
So I love that, because I am engaging every day with a whole lot of capitalists who are seeing increasingly, it feels like, Gary, this opportunity, this investment opportunity in also doing good. Was there an inflection point where this became possible, the WaterEquity Fund? Was it because of the appetite growing, or was it because the model didn't exist before? What was the key moment in getting that stood up?
I think the key moment was when we were working with some of our local partners around the world, and we asked them what's preventing them from scaling up these loan portfolios much more. And it was an answer of, access to access to affordable and consistent capital. And at the same time, Matt and I were in the Jeep driving around India when we were talking to our partners about this, and that's where we kind of hatched this idea of bringing the capital markets in through social impact investing. So it's kind of a perfect storm, right? We saw this incredible demand, and we see about an $18 billion demand for these small loans among people living in poverty that could serve about 800 million people. And we saw that demand bubbling from the bottom up in the form of our partners saying we need more capital to get out more loans for more water connections and more toilets. At the same time, we saw social impact investing really starting to come into its own. And so we were able to create WaterEquity as really the first asset manager that's focused exclusively on solving this crisis, to be able to bring in those accredited investors, match that with people at the household level to get the loans from that capital, and provide that attractive rate of return to investors while still helping people get water.
So Jennifer, let's talk a little bit more about the philanthropic side then. especially in this time of crisis where there are so many people in need, so many organizations. We talked about this at the top of the conversation. How are you seeing the philanthropic side, both from an individual and a corporate perspective?
Yeah, I mean, the philanthropic environment right now is interesting. What we see is that philanthropists are stepping up in a way that has been unprecedented in some ways. What we're seeing is that a lot of those funds are going towards relief, immediate relief, and the important issues of racial justice. And so what we are seeing is that now more than ever, we need to accelerate progress against water and sanitation. It is the first and the second line defense against pandemic. And frankly, the philanthropic environment for water and sanitation is challenging. So what we are trying to do is help folks think about this as building global resilience, that we need to invest in water and sanitation. At water.org, we need people to come and visit, whether you can give $10 or $1 million to donate to water.org to accelerate. COVID, we've identified more than 25 million projects that we want to accelerate to redouble our efforts in the light of COVID. But frankly, Jason, it is a challenging environment for us, given that so much is going against immediate relief. And if I could just say one other thing about the stakeholders that need to participate in this issue. As I referenced earlier, corporations and their use of water. We need corporations to step up. We are fortunate to work with dozens of corporations and corporate foundations in fulfilling their water and stewardship needs. And what we want to see, and what we're starting to see through things like the Water Resilience Coalition, is these corporations not only elevating their ambitions, but accelerating their actions. And we want to partner with those corporations, we at water.org, and use their philanthropy and that of philanthropists catalytically to create this system that wraps around that woman living in poverty and creates a sustainable solution.
Well, Gary, there's certainly, I mean, one of the things that I think is so appealing about this is you have a clarity of purpose, and both of you have talked about it so well, and it's so fundamental to what we're all striving for here. As we wrap up, I mean, what gives you in the sense of maybe ending with some optimism, what does make you optimistic? What gives you a sense of hope at a time when, man, we're looking for some?
I think what gives me hope is that the power of the people that we're trying to help get access to safe water and sanitation. I mean, they are the ones who understand the value in that, and they're the ones who are willing to invest in helping create that value for their family, whether that's their daughter now being able to go to school because she's not carrying water, or because they're saving on medicine because they're not sick all the time. And that's what drives us. They're the center of this work. This is why the market can work, because right now, connecting people like that to the capital markets, it's a broken system. And that's why we exist with our philanthropic capital, to kind of help correct that failure. And, we've been doing this for 30 years, and we've developed a lot of different insights into this, into how we can do it. And we can do more of it. I think Jennifer mentioned, we have $25 million worth of projects and initiatives that are ready and waiting to go, so that we can scale this up further. And so to me, what we've done is like become this innovation engine in this market, helping people understand that it is there, and then finding these different tools, whether it be philanthropy to scale this up and create new solutions, whether it be helping corporations pursue their ESG scores and drive those up because they are looking at their social license to operate with respect to water for these communities where we work, or whether it's impact investing and looking to accredited investors to come in and deploy their capital in a way that gets them that financial return that they need, but also then serves those needing water. In particular, foundations right now, as we look towards foundations investing in mission-related investments and these types of things, we can deliver that type of impact. We can solve this global water crisis. We can do it from the bottom up with the people who are impacted by it, and from the top down with the people who can bring the capital.
All right. Well, a really interesting discussion. I learned a ton. I know that our audience did as well. As I said, this is a core issue for us as humans. It's a core issue as it relates to the environment, a core issue as it relates to, as we all figure out where we go from here. My thanks to Gary White, the CEO and co-founder of water.org, and as well to Jennifer Schorsch. She is the president of water.org. They joined me from their respective locales, Kansas City and Seattle, respectively. I'm going to send it back over to my partner, Carol Masser, now for Bloomberg Businessweek. And thank you all in the Bloomberg Green Festival.